Summer 1940. Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. Now, Hitler's eyes turned to Britain. The Luftwaffe had 2,500 aircraft. Britain had barely 800 fighters to defend the entire nation. German high command believed they could destroy the RAF in 4 weeks. They had the numbers, the experience, and momentum, but they didn't account for one thing: a single aircraft design that would prove to be one of the greatest fighters ever built. This is the story of how the Supermarine Spitfire, against overwhelming odds, saved Britain from invasion. The battle wasn't just in the sky. It was for survival itself. June 26, 1940. Dunkirk had ended just 3 weeks earlier. Over 338,000 British and French soldiers had been evacuated from the beaches, but they'd left behind every tank, every gun, every vehicle they'd brought to France. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped annihilation by the narrowest of margins. Now Britain stood utterly alone. France had capitulated on June 22nd. Norway was lost. Denmark was lost. Poland, crushed the previous September, seemed like ancient history now. In less than a year, Nazi Germany had conquered an empire stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. Adolf Hitler stood at the apex of his power. His Wehrmacht had achieved what Kaiser Wilhelm's army couldn't manage in 4 years of the Great War: the complete defeat of France. The Blitzkrieg had proven unstoppable. Panzer divisions supported by Stuka dive bombers had torn through Allied defenses like they were made of paper. The whole world watched in stunned disbelief as the impossible became reality. But Britain refused to surrender. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had taken office just 6 weeks earlier as France collapsed, told Parliament and the world that Britain would fight on. His speech on June 18th left no doubt about British intentions. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Hitler didn't believe him. Neither did his generals. How could one island nation, stripped of its army's equipment, facing the most powerful military machine ever assembled, possibly resist? The answer, they all agreed, was simple: it couldn't. Hitler issued Directive No. 16 on July 16, 1940. It began with 3 words that would have ended British independence. "I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England. Operation Sea Lion." The code name for the invasion that would finish what the Wehrmacht had started in Poland. The plan was straightforward: land 260,000 troops on the beaches between Folkestone and Brighton. Establish a beachhead, drive on London, force surrender within weeks. German staff officers estimated they could reach the capital in less than a month. But there was one prerequisite, one absolute requirement before the invasion fleet could sail: air superiority. The Royal Navy still controlled the Channel, and the Kriegsmarine couldn't challenge British battleships and cruisers directly. German planners understood that troop-carrying barges crossing the narrow straits would be helpless against Royal Navy destroyers, unless the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, unless German bombers could sink British warships before they reached the invasion force. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was supremely confident. He told Hitler the RAF could be destroyed in 4 weeks. His staff officers agreed. The mathematics seemed simple. Germany had approximately 2,500 aircraft available for operations against Britain. The RAF's fighter command, responsible for defending British airspace, had roughly 800 fighters split between Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes. More importantly, German pilots had just won the greatest air campaign in history. They'd swept Polish, Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, and French air forces from the sky. They'd perfected the art of close air support, turning Stuka dive bombers into flying artillery that could break enemy formations with psychological terror as much as explosive power. Luftwaffe fighter pilots were combat veterans with months of experience. Many had fought in Spain during the Civil War. They knew their aircraft intimately. They'd developed tactics through hard-won lessons. The RAF, by contrast, seemed barely capable of defense. During the Battle of France, Fighter Command had committed only a fraction of its strength, desperately husbanding resources for the defense of Britain itself. The squadrons that had fought over France had been mauled. Pilot losses were horrific. Aircraft losses even worse. German intelligence estimated the RAF was on its last legs, barely capable of offering token resistance. What neither Hitler nor Goering nor the German High Command understood was that Britain possessed three things that would prove decisive. First, a defensive system unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the world. Second, a commander who understood exactly how to use that system. And third, an aircraft that, in the hands of determined pilots, could match anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. The system was called the Dowding System, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding was 58 years old in 1940, a quiet, methodical officer who'd spent years preparing for exactly this battle. While other commanders advocated sending more fighters to France, Dowding had fought bitterly to preserve Fighter Command's strength. He'd calculated the minimum number of fighter squadrons needed to defend Britain. He'd concluded that sending more aircraft to France would only result in their destruction without saving France itself. He'd been proven right. Now he commanded the battle that would determine whether Britain survived as an independent nation. Dowding's system was revolutionary. It began with radar, a British invention that could detect aircraft at distances up to 100 miles. A chain of radar stations along the British coast provided early warning of incoming raids. The information fed into Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where plotters tracked every raid in real time using a massive table map. From there, instructions went out to group headquarters, then to individual fighter stations, then to aircraft already airborne. The result was a defensive network that could vector fighters directly onto incoming raids with unprecedented precision. German bombers crossing the channel could be tracked from takeoff. British fighters could be positioned to intercept with altitude advantage. The Luftwaffe would discover that surprise, the cornerstone of Blitzkrieg's success, was nearly impossible to achieve over Britain. But the system was only as good as the aircraft it controlled. And in summer 1940, Fighter Command relied on two fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane was a solid, reliable aircraft, sturdy, easy to repair, steady gun platform. It equipped most of Fighter Command's squadrons and would ultimately shoot down more German aircraft during the Battle of Britain than any other type. But the Spitfire was something else entirely, something special. The aircraft had been designed by Reginald Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine Aviation. Mitchell had spent the 1920s and early 1930s designing racing seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy, pushing the boundaries of speed and performance. In 1934, the Air Ministry issued a specification for a new fighter to replace the biplane designs that still equipped the RAF. Mitchell threw everything he'd learned into the design. The result was revolutionary. Elliptical wings that provided optimal lift distribution, a slim fuselage built around the magnificent Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a V-12 liquid-cooled power plant producing 1,030 horsepower, 8 .303 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, giving a combined rate of fire of 9,600 rounds per minute, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpit, speed approaching 370 miles per hour. The prototype first flew on March 5, 1936. Test pilots were immediately impressed. The Spitfire handled beautifully, responding to control inputs with precision that made other fighters seem sluggish. It could outturn anything in the sky. It could climb faster than contemporary fighters. And it looked like it was built for speed even sitting motionless on the ground. Tragically, Reginald Mitchell never saw his creation in combat. He died of cancer on June 11, 1937. At just 42 years old. The first production Spitfires were delivered to the RAF in August 1938, 15 months after Mitchell's death. He never knew that his elegant fighter would save his nation. By July 1940, when the Luftwaffe began its assault on Britain, Fighter Command had 19 Spitfire squadrons operational. Each squadron nominally had 12 aircraft, though combat readiness varied. Maintenance issues, battle damage, and pilot availability meant actual strength fluctuated daily. The Spitfire equipped fewer squadrons than the Hurricane, but it had one critical role: engage enemy fighters while Hurricanes attacked the bombers. The Germans began their campaign cautiously. July saw attacks on Channel convoys, probing British defenses, testing RAF response times. Luftwaffe commanders wanted to understand what they faced before launching the main assault. They discovered that British fighters appeared with surprising frequency, often with altitude advantage. Losses were higher than expected, but German confidence remained unshaken. Then came August. The Eagle attack. Adler Tag in German. The Luftwaffe launched massive assaults designed to destroy fighter command on the ground. Airfields were hit repeatedly. Sector stations, the nerve centers coordinating fighter operations, were targeted. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Hangars were wrecked. Runways were cratered. The plan was working. By mid-August, fighter command was reeling. Airfields across southern England were taking devastating damage. More critically, pilot losses were mounting to unsustainable levels. Fighter command had started the battle with approximately 1,400 pilots. By late August, over 200 were dead or missing. Another 150 were wounded. The replacement training units couldn't keep pace. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron Flying Hurricanes, later described those days. We were on constant readiness from dawn to dusk. 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day. Taking off, climbing to 20,000 feet, engaging the enemy, landing to refuel and rearm, taking off again. The exhaustion was indescribable. Pilots were falling asleep in their cockpits on the ground, waiting for the scramble bell. The scramble bell. The most feared sound in every fighter pilot's life that summer. It meant racing to your aircraft, pulling on helmet and oxygen mask while ground crew helped strap you in. Engine start. Taxi. Takeoff. Climb at full power. The Merlin engine screaming, burning fuel at prodigious rates. Get altitude. Get position. Engage. Combat at 20,000 feet or higher. The air so thin you needed oxygen continuously, or you'd pass out. The cold so intense it froze moisture in your oxygen mask. The altitude so high that if your aircraft was hit and caught fire, you had to make an agonizing choice: burn to death or bail out and risk not regaining consciousness before hitting the ground. Then there were the Germans. The Luftwaffe's primary fighter was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, specifically the E model that equipped most fighter units in 1940. The 109 was an excellent aircraft. Fast. Well armed with 2 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns. Good rate of climb. Experienced pilots. The 109 versus the Spitfire. The matchup that would determine the battle's outcome. On paper, they were remarkably similar. Maximum speed within 10 miles per hour of each other. Service ceiling nearly identical. Both powered by inverted V12 engines producing roughly the same horsepower. Both armed with batteries of guns, though the German 20mm cannons had more hitting power per round than British machine guns. But in practice, each had distinct advantages. The Bf 109 could dive faster, thanks to fuel injection that prevented the Merlin engine from cutting out during negative G maneuvers. The 109 also had better altitude performance above 25,000 feet. German pilots quickly learned to exploit these advantages, attacking from above, diving through British formations, then using speed to disengage before Spitfires could respond. But the Spitfire could turn inside the 109. Those elliptical wings Mitchell had designed generated phenomenal lift. In a turning fight, a well-flown Spitfire could get onto a 109's tail and stay there. Once a Spitfire was behind you in a turn, the only escape was to dive away and hope British 8-gun battery didn't find you first. The result was a battle where pilot skill mattered more than aircraft performance. The best German pilots could defeat mediocre British pilots regardless of aircraft. The best British pilots could do the same to Germans. But when equals met, the combat became a lethal chess match where one mistake meant death. Flight Lieutenant Al Deer, a New Zealander flying Spitfires with 54 Squadron, shot down his first 109 on July 9th during a convoy patrol. He later described the encounter. I got on his tail during a turn. He tried to dive away, but I'd anticipated it and was already pushing forward on the stick. 2-second burst at 250 yards, saw strikes on his fuselage and wing root, smoke, then fire. He rolled inverted and went straight in from 15,000 feet, no parachute. Deer would survive the war with 22 confirmed victories. He was shot down 7 times, bailed out 3 times, and walked away from 4 crash landings. He became friends with several German pilots after the war. One of them told him years later that Luftwaffe pilots had learned to fear the Spitfire more than any other British aircraft. The Hurricane was dangerous, the German said, but the Spitfire was death itself if the pilot knew what he was doing. By late August, fighter command was approaching breaking point. Not from aircraft losses. Production had actually increased. with factories turning out more Spitfires and Hurricanes than the Germans were shooting down. The crisis was pilots. The human element. Young men in their early 20s flying multiple sorties daily, watching friends die, knowing that tomorrow or the next day or the day after might be their last. Squadron leader Tom Gleave, commanding 253 Squadron, remembered seeing pilots' faces change over those weeks. Boys aged years and days. The stress was inhuman. You'd see a man climb out of his Spitfire after combat, and his hands would be shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. But 30 minutes later, the bell would ring, and he'd climb back into the cockpit and do it again. Then the Germans made their fatal mistake. On August 24th, a German bomber formation got lost over London and accidentally dropped bombs on the capital. London had been off-limits. Hitler had ordered the Luftwaffe to avoid civilian areas, not from humanitarian concern, but because he still hoped Britain might negotiate. The accidental bombing gave Churchill the excuse he needed to retaliate. On August 25th, RAF bombers struck Berlin. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact on Hitler was enormous. He'd assured the German people that no enemy bomber would reach the Reich capital. Now Berlin had been bombed. In a rage, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from Fighter Command's airfields to London itself. The Blitz was about to begin. It was the turning point. The moment Fighter Command had been given the breathing room it desperately needed. September 7, 1940. Late afternoon. Over 300 German bombers escorted by 600 fighters crossed the Channel headed for London. The attacks would continue for 57 consecutive nights, killing over 40,000 British civilians and destroying huge sections of the city. But by targeting London instead of Fighter Command's infrastructure, the Luftwaffe gave British fighter squadrons time to recover. Damaged airfields were repaired. New pilots arrived from training units. Aircraft production continued accelerating. The mathematical equation was shifting in Britain's favor. September 15th became the climax, a date now celebrated in Britain as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London, determined to break British morale and force surrender. German intelligence believed Fighter Command was down to its last few squadrons, barely capable of putting up token resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. When the first raid crossed the Channel that morning, Fighter Command launched every available squadron. Over 300 fighters rose to meet the attack. Spitfires and Hurricanes swarmed the German formations. The air battle raged from 20,000 feet down to rooftop level over London. German bomber crews, accustomed to encountering perhaps 50 British fighters, found themselves facing 6 times that number. The psychological impact was devastating. Where was the defeated RAF they'd been told about? How could the British still have so many fighters? Churchill, visiting 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge, watched the battle develop on the plotting table. He turned to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, and asked, "What reserves do we have?" Park's answer was simple and terrifying. "None, sir. Every squadron is engaged." For 30 minutes, Fighter Command had nothing left. If the Germans had launched a third wave, there would have been nothing to stop them. But the German commanders, shaken by the fierce resistance and mounting losses, held back. They'd been told the RAF was finished. Instead, they'd encountered the most ferocious defense yet. The Luftwaffe attacked again that afternoon. Again, Fighter Command rose to meet them. Again. Fierce battles raged over southern England. By nightfall, the Germans had lost 56 aircraft destroyed with many more damaged. Fighter Command lost 29 fighters, but crucially, most British pilots survived to fight again, either bailing out over friendly territory or crash landing and walking away. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Kriegsmarine had been warning for weeks that crossing the Channel without air superiority would be suicidal. Now it was clear the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver that superiority. The invasion was off. Britain had survived. The Spitfire, along with the Hurricane and the men who flew them, had accomplished what seemed impossible just months earlier. They'd defeated the Luftwaffe in daylight combat. They'd saved their nation from invasion. They'd preserved the last bastion of democracy in Western Europe. The battle continued through October as the Luftwaffe shifted increasingly to night bombing, but the daylight air superiority battle was won. German losses continued mounting. By October 31st, when historians traditionally mark the end of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,533 aircraft. Fighter Command had lost 915 fighters. But the critical difference was that British losses were sustainable. Factories were producing aircraft faster than they were being shot down. The Empire and Commonwealth were providing replacement pilots. The doubting system remained intact. Germany, by contrast, couldn't replace its losses at the same rate. Experienced pilots were dying, taking their knowledge with them. Churchill understood what had been accomplished. On August 20th, with the battle still raging, he'd given a speech to Parliament that included one of history's most famous lines. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The few. The name stuck. Fighter Command's pilots would forever be remembered as the few who saved Britain. And the Spitfire became a legend. The aircraft would continue evolving throughout the war. More powerful engines, better armament, improved performance. The Spitfire Mark IX, introduced in 1942, could match anything the Luftwaffe fielded. Later Marks served in every theater of war, from the Arctic to the Pacific. Total production exceeded 20,000 aircraft, making it the most produced British fighter ever. Variants remained in frontline service into the 1950s. The final combat sortie by an RAF Spitfire occurred in 1954, during the Malayan Emergency. 14 years after the Battle of Britain, Mitchell's design was still fighting. But its greatest achievement would always be those desperate months in 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi tyranny, when 800 fighters faced 2,500 German aircraft, when the outcome seemed hopeless and survival impossible. The Spitfire's technological excellence merged with human courage to produce a victory that changed history. If Fighter Command had failed, if the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, if Operation Sea Lion had succeeded, the entire trajectory of World War II would have been different. There would have been no base for Allied operations against occupied Europe, no staging ground for the invasion that would liberate France, no sanctuary for governments in exile from across conquered Europe. The aircraft that became Britain's symbol of defiance was more than just a weapon. It represented what was possible when engineering brilliance, industrial capacity, and human determination combined. Reginald Mitchell had designed an airframe so fundamentally sound that it could be continuously improved throughout 6 years of war. Rolls-Royce had created an engine that could be developed from 1,030 horsepower to over 2,000. Supermarine and a network of shadow factories produced them by the thousands. But ultimately, the Spitfire's legend rests on the men who flew it. The 20-year-olds who climbed into cramped cockpits day after day, knowing the statistics said they'd be dead within weeks. The pilots who fought when exhausted, when terrified, when every instinct screamed to run. The crews who kept them flying despite bombs falling on their airfields. Today, fewer than 60 Spitfires remain airworthy out of more than 20,000 built. When one appears at an air show, the crowds fall silent. The distinctive elliptical wings are unmistakable. The Merlin engine's sound, that beautiful, aggressive roar, transports listeners back to 1940. Veterans who fought in other theaters, who flew other aircraft, still speak of the Spitfire with reverence. American pilots who transitioned from Spitfires to P-51 Mustangs or P-47 Thunderbolts admitted the British fighter was special. German pilots who survived the war acknowledged they'd faced a masterpiece. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who commanded Luftwaffe fighters during the Battle of Britain and rose to lead the entire fighter arm, was asked after the war what single thing would have helped Germany most during the battle. His answer was simple: a squadron of Spitfires. The mathematics of the battle tell part of the story. The radar network tells another part. Dowding's tactics, Churchill's leadership, British determination, all were crucial. But at the center of everything was Mitchell's elliptical-winged creation. Fast enough to catch German bombers, maneuverable enough to fight German fighters, tough enough to survive combat damage, and beautiful enough to inspire a nation. In the end, that's what the Spitfire represented: hope. In Britain's darkest hour, when invasion seemed inevitable and defeat appeared certain, the sight of Spitfires climbing to meet the enemy told every Briton that someone was fighting back, that resistance was possible, that victory might be achieved. The Spitfire didn't win the Battle of Britain alone, but without it, Britain would certainly have lost. And if Britain had fallen in 1940, if Hitler had successfully invaded and conquered the British Isles, the course of the 20th century would have been unrecognizably different. 1 aircraft, 8 machine guns, a revolution in fighter design, and the determination of a few hundred young men who refused to let their nation fall. Summer 1940. Germany had conquered Europe. Britain stood alone. 800 fighters faced 2,500 German aircraft. The odds were impossible. The situation was hopeless. But the Spitfire had something the Germans didn't account for. It had pilots who understood what was at stake. It had engineers who'd built it right. And it had that indefinable quality that separates merely good aircraft from legendary ones. The Supermarine Spitfire saved Britain from invasion. In doing so, it preserved democracy in Western Europe. It kept alive the hope of liberation for millions living under Nazi occupation. It became the symbol of a nation's finest hour. And 70 years later, when a Spitfire's Merlin engine roars overhead at an air show, everyone who hears it remembers. This is the aircraft that saved the world.